She arrived for her delivery, but was shocked to see her ex as the doctor. What he did next left everyone speechless. My beautiful family, you will enjoy this story. Watch till the end, feel every moment, and if it touches your heart, don't forget to like this video, comment below, and subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories from your brother, Mr. Peter. I love you all. She once believed that love was the bridge between two worlds, the kind of belief that makes you brave enough to cross oceans barefoot. But bridges burn, worlds collapse. And some women learn that surviving is its own kind of courage, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, only for one more sunrise. She had survived without him. She would survive the rest of her life the same way, or so she thought, until destiny rolled her into an emergency room and placed her dying heartbeat directly into the hands of the man who'd once held it willingly, then let it shatter on the ground. The ambulance doors exploded open when the evening shift was drowning in chaos. Paramedics wheeled Thandie Lumi through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear, their voices urgent as they rattled off numbers that meant nothing to her unconscious mind, but everything to the medical team receiving her. Blood pressure dropping, fetal heart rates decelerating, hemorrhaging, 8 months pregnant with twins, working until she collapsed at the factory. No next of kin listed. Just a woman alone in her crisis. The receiving nurse cut away her clothes with practiced efficiency, revealing a body that told stories through its scars. A burn mark on her right forearm, a faded bruise on her ribs, calluses on her hands that spoke of manual labor, a gauntness suggesting too many skipped meals. Her face, even unconscious, carried tension that never released, as if her body had forgotten how to rest. Dr. Robert Finney was 3 doors down when the code was called. He'd been suturing a laceration, his hands steady, his mind half-occupied with a surgical journal he'd been reading during lunch. The overhead speaker crackled with emergency. He finished the last stitch with speed that came from muscle memory, gave quick instructions, and strode toward the delivery room with his white coat billowing like a sail catching wind. He pushed through the doors, already issuing orders, his eyes scanning monitors. Placental abruption, possible uterine rupture, both babies in distress, the mother's vitals cascading toward dangerous territory. Minutes, not hours. He called for the surgical team, for anesthesia, for blood products. His voice carried calm authority that made chaos organize itself. He scrubbed at the sink, his mind mapping the procedure, calculating risks. Panic saved no one. Hesitation killed. The soap ran over his hands in rhythmic circles, while he forced his breathing to slow. When he returned to the delivery room, gloved and gowned, he finally looked at the patient's face. The nurse stepped back, giving him a clear view. The world tilted. Time stopped and accelerated simultaneously. His hands began to shake so violently he had to clasp them together. A nurse asked if he was all right, her voice distant underwater. He couldn't answer, couldn't breathe. He could only stare at the woman on the table and feel his carefully constructed life crack apart like glass under a hammer. Thandie Lumi, the name on her wristband carved into his bones. He'd spent 5 years trying to forget it, trying to convince himself that time would erase her face from his memory. 5 years of lying that he'd moved on, that his choice to walk away had been right. And now she was here, unconscious and dying, and he was the only thing standing between her and oblivion. She looked nothing like he remembered, and exactly like her all at once. Thinner, hollowed by hunger or stress. The cheekbones more prominent, shadows under her eyes darker. A scar cutting through her left eyebrow. Her hair shorter, cropped close in a style more practical than decorative. Even unconscious, there was tension in her jaw, suggesting she'd learned to carry pain without sound. A nurse touched his shoulder. They needed to move. The babies were in distress. The mother's blood pressure was dropping. He could have his crisis later. Right now, he needed to be a doctor. He nodded, swallowed the boulder in his throat, and locked every emotion into a steel box he welded shut. There would be time for feeling later. Right now there was only the work. His hands stopped shaking. His voice steadied. He became the surgeon she needed, the one trained for this exact emergency. He called for the scalpel and made the first incision with precision that comes from years of practice. Blood welled up and he worked through it, movements economical and sure. The first baby came out blue and silent. His heart stopped until the pediatric team cleared the airways, and the cry that followed was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. A boy, small but fighting, fists already clenched. The second baby followed moments later, a girl, tinier than her brother, with the same fierce determination written into every labored breath. They whisked the twins away, and he focused on Thandi, on stopping the bleeding, on making sure she survived this night. When he finally closed the last suture and stepped back, when her vitals stabilized, he stood there looking at her. The anesthesia kept her unconscious, kept her safe from awareness, and he was grateful. He didn't know what he'd say if she opened her eyes and saw him. He didn't know if she'd scream or weep or turn away. Hours later, after checking on the twins in the neonatal unit, after writing orders and reviewing charts, he found himself alone in his office with the door locked and lights off. He sat in his chair and stared at his hands, these hands that had just saved her life, and wondered if she would thank him or curse him for it. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't read. His pager went off twice. Outside his office, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm. But inside, time had stopped. Inside, there was only the echo of her name and the weight of questions he might never get to ask. When he finally walked back to check her post-operative condition, when he stood in the doorway watching her sleeping face in the dim monitor glow, he made a promise. He would not run this time. Would not let fear make his decisions, would not walk away, even if staying meant facing every mistake he'd ever made. Whatever happened next, whatever she decided when she woke and found him standing over her like some ghost from a past she'd probably spent years trying to forget, he would be there. He would stay. The nurse doing rounds noticed him and asked if he needed something. He shook his head and turned to leave, but glanced back one more time at the woman who'd once been his entire world. As he walked toward whatever came next, one thought burned through his mind with the intensity of prayer. She was alive, and that meant there was still a chance, however small, however impossible, that love might find a way to survive even the worst kind of damage. He didn't yet know about the passionate night that would come later, about the letter she'd leave that would never reach his hands, about the daughter sleeping in the nursery who carried his blood and his features. He didn't know that fate wasn't finished with them yet, that the story he thought had ended was only beginning, that some loves refuse to die no matter how hard you try to bury them. But he would learn. When the truth revealed itself, when all the secrets came rushing to the surface like bodies from deep water, the question wouldn't be whether they could survive it. The question would be whether surviving was enough, or if they needed something more. Something neither knew how to ask for, but both desperately needed. A second chance at getting it right. Chapter 2. The Awakening of Buried Truths Consciousness. Return to Thandi Lumi the way dawn breaks over a battlefield. Slow and painful and full of smoke. Her body registered pain first. A deep ache radiating from her abdomen outward, like rings in water, followed by awareness of tubes and wires, and the steady beep of machines measuring her continued existence. Her mouth tasted of copper and chemicals. Her throat felt scraped raw. When she tried opening her eyes, the fluorescent lights stabbed through her skull. She made a sound that was half-groan before managing to crack her eyelids open. Hospital. The realization came with panic that made the monitors accelerate. The babies. Where were her babies? She tried sitting up and discovered her body had other plans. A wave of agony forced her back against pillows with a cry that brought a nurse rushing in. The woman placed a palm on her shoulder with gentle pressure, telling her to stay still, to breathe, that everything would be all right. "My babies," she rasped, her voice barely recognizable. "Where are my babies?" The nurse smiled with genuine warmth. "Your babies are perfect. A boy and a girl. They're in the neonatal unit being monitored, but they're healthy and strong. You can see them soon. Relief crashed through Thandie so intensely it felt physical, as if someone had cut strings holding her suspended, and she was falling. But this time, the landing was soft. She closed her eyes and felt tears leak from the corners. Alive. Her children were alive. She hadn't failed them. The nurse checked her vitals, adjusted her IV, explained she'd undergone emergency cesarean section, that she'd been unconscious for almost 2 days. Then he listened to words float past like debris in a river, catching pieces but unable to hold on to anything concrete. 2 days. She'd lost 2 days. Who performed the surgery? Thandie asked, her voice stronger now, needing to know who she owed her life to. The nurse paused, something flickering across her face. Dr. Robert Finney. He's one of our best. You were very lucky he was on duty. The name hit her like a fist to the chest. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. The machines beside her bed began their urgent song again. Robert, Dr. Robert Finney. It couldn't be the same person. The universe wasn't that deliberately cruel. There were thousands of doctors named Robert. The odds were astronomical. Impossible. It had to be coincidence, but even as she told herself this, she knew. Some buried instinct recognized fate arranging itself around her like a noose. He was here, in this hospital. He'd touched her while she was unconscious. His hands had been inside her body, cutting her open, pulling her children from her womb. The intimacy made her feel violated and grateful in equal measure. The nurse said something about rest, about not getting agitated, but Thandie barely heard. She stared at the ceiling and tried to process what this meant, tried to understand if this was punishment or mercy or the universe's sick joke. She'd spent 5 years building a life that had nothing to do with him. 5 years learning to exist where he wasn't waiting around every corner. 5 years teaching herself she didn't need him. And now he was 3 doors down, wearing a white coat and saving lives. Probably having no idea that the woman he'd just operated on was the same woman whose heart he'd shattered on a sidewalk half a decade ago. The nurse left after making her promise to rest. Thandie nodded and agreed while already planning to ignore most instructions. She waited until footsteps faded, until hospital sounds settled back into usual rhythm, then carefully shifted herself higher to see out the small window in her door. The corridor was busy with organized chaos. Nurses moved between rooms. An orderly pushed a meal cart. Someone's family walked past talking in worried voices. And then at the far end, she saw him. He stood at the nurse's station reviewing a chart, his profile sharp against fluorescent lighting. Even from this distance, through the small window, she recognized the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the particular tilt of his head when concentrating. Robert Finney looked older. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there. Hair shorter, more severe, touched with grey at temples. He wore his white coat like armor. There was something in the set of his spine, suggesting weight he hadn't carried when she knew him. He looked tired. Successful, clearly, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with lack of purpose. She watched him finish notes, hand the chart back, turn to walk down the corridor. For 3 heartbeats, she thought he'd walk right past without looking, and she felt both relief and crushing disappointment. But then he stopped, right in front of her door. His hand rose, as if to push it open, then fell back to his side. He stood frozen, staring at the door the way someone stares at a cave that might contain treasure or monsters. She held her breath, waiting. He did nothing. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched slightly forward. So he did know. He knew exactly who she was, and he was avoiding her, which meant either he felt guilty or he felt nothing and didn't want the awkwardness of reunion. The day passed in a blur of medical checks, and pain medication and nurses encouraging her to eat, even though everything tasted like cardboard. They brought her children in the late afternoon, wheeling them in plastic bassinets like precious cargo. When she held them for the first time while fully conscious, when she looked down at their tiny, perfect faces and counted fingers and toes, she felt something break open inside her chest that had been locked tight for years. The girl was smaller, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through her. The boy was louder, already making his presence known, with lusty cries the nurses said were good signs. She held them both against her chest and whispered promises into their soft hair. Promises that she'd protect them, that she'd be enough, that they'd never know abandonment. When the nurse came to take them back for monitoring, Thandi asked about birth certificates. The nurse handed her forms and a pen. She stared at blank spaces where their identities would be written into official existence. She'd thought about names during pregnancy, during long nights when she couldn't sleep. She'd made lists and crossed them out, trying to find names that meant something, that would give her children strength. For the girl, she wrote Amara Soleil, Amara meaning eternal, unfading, Soleil meaning sun, a name promising permanence and light. For the boy, she wrote Elior Zain, Elior meaning God is my light, Zain meaning God's gracious gift, names that felt like prayers, hopes made solid. Night fell outside her window, and the hospital shifted into its nocturnal rhythm. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to stop replaying the image of Robert standing outside her door like a man at a crossroads. She didn't hear the door open, didn't know he was there until she turned her head and saw him standing just inside the threshold, backlit by corridor lights, his face in shadow. They stared at each other across the small distance of the hospital room. Across the vast distance of 5 years. I didn't know if you'd be awake, he said finally. His voice rough and low, and she heard in it the same exhaustion she felt in her bones. She wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to scream at him. But what came out was something small and broken and unbearably honest. You shouldn't be here. I know, he said, and took one step further into the room, letting the door close behind him with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning, like a decision being made, like the beginning of something neither was ready for but could no longer avoid. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Histories. The silence between them was thick enough to choke on. Then Dee watched him stand in the dim light, this man who used to know every inch of her soul, who now looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. He'd aged in ways that went beyond grey at his temples. There was a heaviness to him now, a gravity that pulled everything inward, as if he'd learned to carry pain the way some people carry scars. Robert didn't move closer. He stayed near the door, as if keeping an escape route open, his hands hanging at his sides. She remembered those hands, remembered them holding her face like she was precious, remembered them letting her go like she was nothing. The babies are healthy, he said, his voice careful and clinical, taking refuge in facts. Amara needed some supplemental oxygen at first, but she's breathing well on her own now. Elio has been strong from the start. Both are feeding adequately. Their prognosis is excellent. She listened to him recite medical information as if they were strangers, as if he hadn't once promised to build her a life where she never had to be afraid again. Something hot and sharp twisted in her stomach. Thank you for the report, Doctor. Is that why you came here in the middle of the night? To give me an update you could have delivered during rounds? He flinched. I came to make sure you were all right. To see if you needed anything? What I need, she said, her voice low and hard, is for you to tell me how this happened. Of all the hospitals in this city, of all the doctors who could have been on duty, how did it end up being you? I work here, he said simply. I have for 3 years. You were brought to the emergency room. I was the attending obstetrician. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just terrible luck. Terrible luck, she repeated, and the laugh that escaped had no humor in it. Is that what we're calling it now? As if the universe doesn't have a sense of irony so cruel it borders on sadistic. Robert took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it, and stopped. I didn't know it was you until they said your name. And by then you were dying and I had a choice. I could save your life, or I could let someone else try while I explained why I was conflicted. I chose to save you. I'd make the same choice again. How noble, she said, acid in every syllable. The great Dr. Finney saves the day. Do you want gratitude? Do you want me to thank you for doing your job? Do you want me to forget that the last time I saw you, you accused me of being a liar and walked away while I was on my knees begging?" The words hung in the air like knives. She watched him absorb them, watched his jaw tighten and his eyes close briefly. "I know what I did," he said quietly. "I know what I said. I've spent 5 years knowing it. Then why are you here?" she demanded, her voice rising despite the pain it caused. "Why are you standing in my room like you have any right? Why didn't you just save my life and walk away? That's what you do best. Walking away. Because I can't," he said, and there was such raw anguish in his voice it stopped her cold. "Because I've tried for 5 years to walk away and I can't. Because seeing you on that table made me realize I've been lying to myself about moving on. I thought I had. I thought enough time would make you into a memory I could file away. But you're not a memory. You're here. You're real. And I can't walk away from you again, even if it would be kinder if I could." She stared at him, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the bedsheets until her knuckles went white. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. "You don't get to show up now and say these things. You don't get to tell me you can't walk away when you already did. When you chose your family and their money over me, when you believed their lies instead of trusting me, it wasn't easier," he said, his voice breaking. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I thought I was protecting you. My family was vicious. They were threatening you, threatening your scholarship, threatening to destroy your reputation. I thought if I ended it, they'd leave you alone. Setting me free," she repeated, and the laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Is that what you thought? You thought destroying me was freedom. You thought leaving me with nothing was kindness. I thought you'd be better off without me," he said desperately. "I thought you'd move on. I thought you'd find someone who could give you the life you deserved." "You thought wrong," she said flatly. "You want to know what happened after you left? I lost my scholarship because I couldn't focus when I was crying too hard to see. I lost my apartment because I couldn't afford rent. I ended up working 3 jobs just to survive, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating 1 meal a day if I was lucky. And then I met someone who seemed kind, who seemed safe. But he wasn't kind, he used me. He drained every penny I earned. He got me pregnant and then disappeared the day I went into labor. So tell me, Robert, tell me how well your protection worked." Each sentence landed like a blow. She watched the color drain from his face, watched him sway slightly. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know. I looked for you. I hired investigators. I didn't want to be found," she said. "I changed my name. I moved across the city. I cut ties with everyone because I couldn't stand the pity in their eyes. I erased myself from the world we shared because existing in it without you was unbearable. So don't tell me you looked for me. You looked for the girl I used to be. She died the day you walked away. I'm someone else now." The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Robert stood there looking like a man who just discovered the ground beneath his feet was quicksand. "The father of your children," Robert said finally. "Where is he now?" "Gone," she said shortly. "He left before they were born. I don't know where, and I don't care. He has no legal rights to them. And you've been alone this entire time." "Raising them alone. I survive," she said. "That's what I do. I survive things that should have killed me, and I keep going because stopping isn't an option when you have 2 lives depending on you." "It's not pity," he said. "It's grief. It's horror at what I did. It's rage at myself for being so blind, so cowardly. It's shame that I get to stand here in this white coat with this successful career while you've been fighting every day just to exist." She looked away because the expression on his face was too raw, too much like the man she used to love. Acknowledging it changes nothing. You can't undo what happened. You can't give me back the years I lost. All you can do is stay away from me and let me rebuild my life without you in it. "What if I can't do that?" he said quietly. "Then that's your problem, not mine," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "I don't owe you anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not another chance to hurt me. You saved my life and I'm grateful. But gratitude doesn't mean I have to let you back in. I don't want to go back," he said. "I want to go forward. I want to know who you are now. I want to know the woman who survived everything I put her through." I want to help you raise these children. The last sentence hung in the air. Thandi felt her entire body go cold. What did you say? Robert met her eyes. Your children, Amara and Elior. I want to help you raise them. I want to be there for them in ways their biological father wasn't. They're not your responsibility, she said, but her voice wavered. Maybe not, he agreed, but I'm offering anyway. You don't have family. You don't have support. You're going to be released from here in a few days with 2 newborns and nowhere to go. Let me help. Let me give you a place to stay until you get back on your feet. I don't want your charity, she said, but even as she said it, she felt the terrible weight of her situation. He was right. She had nowhere to go. The apartment she'd been renting was a single room, barely big enough for herself. She had no savings, no family. She was about to be homeless with 2 babies, and the only person offering her a lifeline was the man who'd once destroyed her. It's not charity, Robert said. It's amends. It's me trying to balance the scales. You don't have to forgive me. You don't have to let me into your heart. But let me help you survive. Let me give you and your children a safe place to land. She wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed to refuse. But practicality was a cruel teacher. Pride didn't feed babies. Pride didn't pay for diapers and formula. Pride didn't keep a roof over your head. I'll think about it, she said finally, hating how weak the words sounded. He nodded slowly. That's all I can ask. I'll leave you to rest now. But Thandi, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know sorry is the smallest, most inadequate word. But I need you to know it anyway. He left before she could respond. She was alone again, with machines beeping and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her chest like stones. She pressed the call button and asked for pain medication, not because the physical pain was unbearable, but because she needed something to dull the sharper agony of emotional wounds just ripped open again. The nurse administered the injection, and Thandi felt medication spread through her veins like warm honey, softening edges, blurring thoughts as consciousness slipped away. Her last thought was a question. If she let him help her, if she accepted his offer, would she be giving him a chance at redemption? Or would she be walking voluntarily back into the fire that had already burned her once? She fell asleep without knowing the answer. In her dreams, she was back on that sidewalk 5 years ago, on her knees in the rain, watching him walk away. Except this time, when she called his name, he turned back. This time he stayed. But dreams were liars, and morning always came with the harsh light of reality. And when she woke, the question would still be waiting for her. Patient and implacable, what was she going to do now? Chapter 4. The Price of Desperation. 3 days after surgery, Thandi was medically cleared for discharge. Her incision was healing well, her pain manageable with oral medication, and the twins were thriving. The discharge papers sat on her bedside table like an execution notice. In 6 hours, she'd be expected to leave this room with 2 newborns, a bag of medical supplies, and absolutely nowhere to go. She'd spent those 3 days making phone calls to every resource she could think of. Shelters were full or had waiting lists, or wouldn't accept someone with newborns. The social worker gave her pamphlets about assistance programs that would take weeks to process, about temporary housing with no openings. Every door opened just wide enough to show there was no room before closing again. Juan Rios hadn't contacted her, hadn't come to the hospital, hadn't shown even a flicker of interest in the children he'd helped create. She was grateful for his absence, even as it confirmed what she'd already known. She was entirely alone. Whatever happened next, she'd face it without him, which was infinitely preferable to facing it with him. Some absences were blessings. The social worker mentioned Robert's offer during one of their meetings, her tone carefully neutral as she pointed out that refusing help out of pride was one thing, but refusing it when 2 infants depended on her was something else entirely. Thandi had wanted to argue, had wanted to explain that accepting help from Robert wasn't about pride, but about self-preservation. But the words died in her throat because the social worker was right. Her feelings didn't matter anymore. Only survival mattered. She'd avoided Robert for those 3 days, as much as someone could avoid the doctor, responsible for their post-operative care. He checked on her during rounds with professional courtesy, asking clinical questions, carefully maintaining a distance that felt both respectful and cowardly. She answered in monosyllables and didn't meet his eyes, and they performed this dance of avoidance while the unspoken offer hung between them like smoke. On the morning of her discharge, he entered her room earlier than usual before shift change chaos. When the hospital was caught in that pre-dawn quiet, he knocked softly, even though the door was open, waited for her nod before entering, and stood at the foot of her bed with his hands in his pockets. "You're being discharged today," he said. "Not a question. Yes. Have you made arrangements?" "Not yet." The lie tasted bitter. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching her face. "My offer still stands. I have a house. It has more rooms than I use. You and the children could stay there until you figure out your next steps. No obligations, no expectations, just a safe place to recover." She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him she'd rather sleep on a park bench. But when she looked down at Amara asleep in the bassinet beside her bed, at the tiny, perfect face that trusted her to make the right choices, the words wouldn't come. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What would you expect in return?" she asked, her voice flat, preparing herself. Robert looked stricken, as if the question itself was an injury. "Nothing. I expect nothing. You'd have your own space, your own privacy. I work long hours, so you'd barely see me. I just want to know you and the children are safe. People don't give without wanting something back," she said. "Even kindness has a price. Then consider this payment on a debt," he said quietly. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Let me start by giving you this small thing." Small thing. He called it a small thing, this offer of shelter when she had none. She supposed to a man like him it was small, but to her it was everything. It was the difference between homelessness and safety. She looked away, blinking back tears that had no business being in her eyes, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'll stay for 1 month, only until I can find a job and a place of my own. And we need rules, boundaries. You don't get to act like you have any claim on me or my children. You don't get to play house. You're providing temporary housing. That's all." "Agreed," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "Whatever boundaries you need, I'll respect them. I'll have one of the guest rooms prepared. It's on the opposite side of the house. You'll have your own bathroom. There's a nursery that was never used, if you want it for the twins, a nursery that was never used." The words hung there, full of implications she didn't want to examine. Had he been married? Had there been loss? She didn't ask because she didn't want to know, didn't want to see him as someone who'd suffered too. "When can we leave?" she asked instead. "I can arrange for a car this afternoon, after the pediatrician does the final check. I'll have everything you need set up at the house. Formula, diapers, clothes. I can provide for my own children," she said sharply, even though they both knew she couldn't, not yet. "I know you can," he said gently, "but let me help until you're back on your feet." She nodded curtly, dismissing him, and he left without trying to say more. When the door closed, she picked up Amara and held her against her chest, breathing in that newborn smell, and tried not to think about the house she'd left. The man who might have given her everything if she'd been brave enough to stay. The car that arrived that afternoon was understated but expensive, driven by a service rather than by Robert himself. She was grateful for his absence. The driver was professional and courteous, loading her meager belongings and the twins' car seats with practiced efficiency. She watched the hospital disappear through the rear window and felt like she was leaving behind the last neutral ground. The drive took them out of the part of the city she knew, away from cramped apartments and corner markets and bus stops where she'd spent the last 5 years. Into neighborhoods where the streets were wider and houses sat behind gates and manicured lawns. She watched the scenery change and felt the distance grow between the woman she'd been this morning and whoever she was about to become. The house was not a mansion, but it was close, a sprawling structure of stone and glass that spoke of wealth worn comfortably. The driver pulled through iron gates that opened automatically, up a circular driveway lined with trees showing autumn colors, and parked in front of double doors that looked heavy enough to keep out armies. Thandi sat in the back seat holding Elior while Amara slept and wondered what she'd just agreed to. Robert emerged from the house before she could decide whether to get out or tell the driver to take her anywhere else. He was in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater that made him look younger and more vulnerable than the white coat did. He approached slowly as if afraid of startling her. He opened her door and offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him bear some of her weight as she stood on legs that felt unsteady. "Welcome," he said quietly. "Let me show you to your room." He carried one of the twins while she carried the other, and led her through a house that was beautiful in an impersonal way, like something from a magazine. They climbed a staircase with a banister that gleamed, walked down a hallway lined with artwork she didn't look at, and stopped in front of a door he opened to reveal a suite bigger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. The room had a large bed with fresh linens, a sitting area with comfortable chairs, windows that overlooked a garden, and an attached bathroom with a tub deep enough to drown in. Through another door, she could see a nursery painted in soft neutrals, equipped with 2 cribs, a changing table, a rocking chair. It looked like something from a dream. It looked like a trap. "I hope this works," Robert said, setting Amara's car seat down gently. "If you need anything changed, just tell me." "This is too much," she said, her voice small despite herself. "It's a room," he said simply, "and you need it. That's all that matters." He left her there with instructions on where to find the kitchen, where he'd be if she needed anything. He didn't linger, didn't try to make conversation, didn't push past boundaries. When the door closed, Thandi stood in the middle of that beautiful room, holding her children, and felt tears slide down her face. Not from gratitude or relief, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying so much weight for so long. She settled the twins in their cribs, watched them sleep with fierce protectiveness. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the garden below, at the roses still blooming despite autumn chill, at the wealth and security that surrounded her like a fortress, and wondered what price she'd eventually have to pay for accepting this shelter, because there was always a price. She'd learned that the hard way. The only question was what form the payment would take, and whether she'd be able to afford it when the bill came due. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, and made a promise to herself. 1 month, maybe 2 at most, just long enough to get her strength back, to find work, to save enough to get out. She wouldn't let herself get comfortable here, wouldn't let herself forget that this was temporary. But even as she made these promises, some small, treacherous part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd changed. Maybe 5 years had taught him something about love and loss. Maybe this time he'd stay. She told that voice to shut up, told it that hope was more dangerous than despair, told it that she'd survived by not believing in second chances. But the voice wouldn't be silenced, and as she stood there in that beautiful room, with her children sleeping peacefully nearby, she felt the first small crack appear in the armor she'd built around her heart, and knew with terrible certainty that she was about to make every mistake she'd promised herself she'd avoid. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Avoidance. The first week passed in careful choreography of avoidance. Robert left for the hospital before dawn and returned long after dark, leaving notes in the kitchen about meals he'd arranged to be delivered, about supplies that had been stocked. Thandi spent those days learning the rhythms of her children, the particular cry that meant hunger versus discomfort, the way Amara would only settle if held on the left side, while Elior preferred the right. The house was quiet in ways that felt both comforting and oppressive. She'd grown used to thin walls, and neighbors shouting and traffic noise. Here, the silence was so complete it felt like being underwater, and sometimes she'd turn on the television just to hear voices, to remember the world still existed beyond these walls. She avoided exploring too much of the house, keeping to her room and the kitchen. It felt like trespassing to wander through spaces that weren't hers. But curiosity was persistent, and on the 8th day, while both twins were sleeping and she had nothing to do except sit with her thoughts, she found herself walking through rooms she hadn't entered before. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, books organized by subject in a way suggesting someone had actually read them. There was a music room with a piano that looked expensive and well-maintained. There was a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12, but showed no signs of ever hosting a meal. The house was beautiful and empty, a monument to loneliness disguised as success. She found herself in what must be his study, a room that smelled of leather and old paper, with a desk covered in medical journals and a wall of framed degrees. She should have left immediately, but something drew her further into the room. There was a photo on his desk, facing away from where he'd sit, and she picked it up without thinking. It showed Robert on what must have been his wedding day, standing next to a woman who was beautiful in a cold, polished way. He looked uncomfortable in the photo, his smile not reaching his eyes, his body angled slightly away from his bride, as if already trying to escape. She set the photo down quickly, feeling like she'd intruded on something private. "That was 3 years ago," Robert's voice came from the doorway, and she jumped. She hadn't heard him come home. "I should have put that away." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't snooping. I was just walking and the door was open." "It's fine," he said, stepping into the room but maintaining distance. "You're not a prisoner. You can go wherever you want." He moved to the desk and turned the photo face down with a gesture that held such finality it felt like an ending. Her name was Elizabeth. The marriage lasted 18 months before she decided my business partner was more interesting. They're engaged now, from what I hear. I should probably burn that photo, but it serves as a useful reminder. Of what? Thandi asked before she could stop herself. That my mother's choice of wife was about as successful as every other decision she's made for me. There was bitterness in his voice she'd never heard before. They stood there in uncomfortable silence. Thandi felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy if she allowed herself to feel anything for him beyond carefully maintained distance. "I should go check on the twins," she said, moving toward the door, needing to escape the intimacy of this moment. "Thandi." He said her name like a prayer. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being here. For letting me help. For giving me a chance to do something right after doing so many things wrong." She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. She just kept walking until she was back in her room with the door closed and her children sleeping peacefully, and the dangerous sympathy locked away where it couldn't betray her. She didn't want to see him as human, didn't want to know about his failed marriage or his loneliness. It was easier to hate him when he was a monster. Harder when he was just a man who'd made terrible choices and was trying to atone. The days continued in their careful pattern. Robert leaving early, returning late, existing in parallel without intersecting. Except sometimes she'd come downstairs to find fresh flowers on the kitchen table, or a book she'd mentioned wanting to read years ago sitting outside her door, or formula that was a different brand because he'd noticed Elior seemed to tolerate it better. Small gestures that said he was paying attention, that he remembered. She hated the flowers, hated the books, hated every small kindness because they made it harder to maintain the anger that kept her safe. It was easier when he was absent. But these gestures, these tiny invasions of thoughtfulness, they complicated everything. On the 12th night, she woke to the sound of crying, but it wasn't her children. She lay in bed listening, trying to identify the source, and realized it was coming from somewhere else in the house. She should have stayed in her room. But something pulled her out of bed, had her wrapping a robe around herself and following the sound to a room she hadn't entered before. The door was cracked open, and through it she could see Robert sitting on the floor with his back against the bed, his head in his hands. his shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside. There was an empty bottle on the nightstand, and the smell of whiskey in the air. She should have left. Should have given him privacy. But instead she pushed the door open further and said his name quietly. And when he looked up at her with eyes red from crying and something that looked like desperation, she made a choice that went against every instinct of self-preservation. She sat down beside him on the floor, close but not touching, and asked the question she'd been avoiding. Why? Why what? His voice was hoarse, wrecked. Why all of this? Why the house and the flowers and the books? What do you want from me? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, I want absolution. I want to stop seeing your face every time I close my eyes. I want to stop wondering if you're safe every moment I'm not watching. I want to stop hating myself. I want forgiveness I don't deserve, and I'm terrified you'll never give it to me, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn something impossible to earn. His words hung in the air, raw and honest. She hugged her knees to her chest and stared at the wall. You can't earn forgiveness. It's not something you buy with flowers and rent-free housing. It's something that happens or doesn't happen, and you can't control it. I know, he whispered, but I have to try. Because the alternative is accepting that I destroyed the best thing in my life, and there's nothing I can do to fix it. I can't accept that. I can't live with that. So this is about you, she said, and there was an edge to her voice. About making yourself feel better. About easing your guilt. Not about me. No, he said urgently, turning to face her. That's not what I meant. I'm explaining this badly. I'm half drunk and exhausted, and I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since you showed up in my emergency room, because every time I close my eyes I see you dying and I can't make it stop. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the dark circles, the weight he'd lost, the tremor in his hands. He looked like someone hanging on by his fingernails. You need to sleep, she said, and was horrified to hear concern in her voice. I can't, he said simply. Every time I try, I dream about losing you again, about watching you die, about all the ways I failed you. You're not failing me, she heard herself say, and wondered when she'd started lying. You're giving me a place to stay. You're helping me take care of my children. That's more than anyone else has done. Your children, he repeated, something strange in his tone. You keep calling them your children. Not our children. Never ours. They're not yours, she said, confused. I know that, he said quickly. I know they belong to you and that man who abandoned you. But sometimes, when I watch you with them, when I see you holding them and loving them, I wish things had been different. I wish we hadn't lost what we had. I wish they were ours. The confession sat between them like something breakable. Thandi felt her throat tighten with emotions she couldn't name. You can't wish for things that never were and never will be. It doesn't change anything. I know, he said again. But knowing something and accepting it are different things. They sat there on the floor in that dark room with the smell of whiskey between them and years of history pressing down like weight. And Thandi felt something shift inside her, some small movement like the first crack in ice before the thaw. She was still angry, still hurt, still convinced that trusting him was dangerous. But she was also tired of carrying all that weight alone, tired of being hard all the time. You need to sleep, she said again, softer this time. You can't help anyone if you work yourself to death. Will you stay? He asked, and his voice was small, almost childlike. Just until I fall asleep. I sleep better when I know you're safe. She should have said no, should have stood up and walked back to her room. But instead she nodded, and when he moved to lie down on the bed, still in his work clothes, she sat in the chair by the window and watched him. His breathing evened out within minutes, the alcohol and exhaustion pulling him under. After an hour, when she was sure he wouldn't wake if she left, she stood to go. But as she passed the bed, his hand shot out and caught her wrist, his grip gentle but insistent. Please, he mumbled, still mostly asleep. Don't leave. Not yet. She could have pulled away. Should have pulled away. Instead, she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, found his hand still holding hers, found herself staying when every instinct told her to run, when his breathing deepened again into true sleep. She carefully extracted her hand and walked back to her room, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, as if it could protect her from the realization settling over her like snow. She was in trouble, because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, somewhere between the flowers and the books, and the careful kindness and the broken man crying on the floor, her armor had developed cracks. And if she wasn't careful, if she didn't guard herself more carefully, those cracks would spread until the whole structure came crashing down, and she'd be left defenseless against the one person who'd already proven he could destroy her. She climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin and told herself that tomorrow she'd start looking for jobs, for apartments, for ways to get out before she made a mistake that would cost her everything. But even as she made that promise, she knew she was lying. She was already making the mistake, had been making it from the moment she agreed to come here. The scariest part was that a small, treacherous part of her was hoping she would. Chapter 6. The night everything changed. 3 weeks into living in Robert's house, Thandi woke to screaming. Not her children's screaming, which she'd become attuned to. This was different, adult, male, coming from Robert's room with such raw terror that she was moving before conscious thought caught up. She found him thrashing in his bed, tangled in sheets soaked with sweat, his voice hoarse from shouting. Nightmares so violent they'd pulled him into some hell she couldn't see. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, and then he screamed her name with such anguish the decision made itself. She crossed to the bed and shook his shoulder, calling his name, trying to pull him back. His eyes flew open, but didn't see her at first, still trapped between sleep and waking. When he grabbed her wrist, his grip was tight enough to bruise. She didn't pull away. She stayed still until recognition flickered into his eyes. "Thandi," he gasped. "You're alive. You're here." "I'm here," she confirmed, sinking down onto the edge of his bed without thinking about boundaries. "I'm fine. The twins are fine. It was just a dream." He pulled her against him then, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength, his face buried in her hair, his whole body shaking. She should have pulled away, but his terror was so palpable that she found herself holding him back, her hands smoothing up and down his back. "I keep seeing you die," he whispered, "every night, 1,000 different ways. And I can't save you. I'm not dead," she said quietly. "I'm right here." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You're really here. This is real. It's real," she confirmed, and the space between them felt charged with something dangerous that made her pulse race. She should move, should go back to her room before this spiraled. But she didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, caught in his gaze. "Tell me what?" she whispered, even though she knew what he was going to say. "That I never stopped loving you," he said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "That every day for 5 years I've thought about you and wondered if you were happy. That seeing you again, even under the worst circumstances, was still the best moment of my life because it meant you were alive. That I'd rather have you hate me from across a room than not have you in the world at all." She should have been angry. But the raw honesty in his voice, the desperation in his eyes, all of it bypassed her anger and went straight to the part of her that had never stopped loving him either. "You don't get to say that to me," she said, but there was no heat in it. "You don't get to tell me you never stopped loving me when you walked away." "I know," he said. "I know I have no right. I know saying it changes nothing. But I needed you to hear it anyway, because if I die tomorrow, I need you to know that you weren't wrong about what we had. It was real. It was everything. And I destroyed it because I was a coward, not because you weren't worth fighting for." His words broke something open inside her, and suddenly she was crying, really crying. All the grief she'd been carrying for 5 years came pouring out. And Robert pulled her close and let her cry against his chest, his arms around her, his own tears falling into her hair. They stayed like that until the storm passed. until her sobs quieted and exhaustion settled over both of them. When he shifted them both down onto the pillows, when he pulled the covers over them, she didn't protest. When his arms stayed around her and her head found that hollow between his shoulder and chest that used to be her favorite place, she didn't pull away. "Just for tonight," she whispered. "Just because we're both exhausted and broken." "Just for tonight," he agreed. But they both knew it was a lie. She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat. And when she woke hours later to early morning light, she found herself tangled around him in ways that were far too intimate. His hand was splayed across her lower back. Her leg was hitched over his hip. Their faces were inches apart. She should move. But as she started to shift away, his arms tightened and his eyes opened, looking directly into hers. "Don't go," he said quietly. "Not yet, please. Tell me to stop," he whispered. "Tell me this is wrong and I'll let you go. I'll never touch you again. Just say the word." She opened her mouth to say exactly that, to end this before it went further. But what came out was, "I can't." "Can't what?" "Can't tell you to stop. Can't pretend I don't want this. Can't keep lying to myself that I stopped loving you just because you broke my heart." He made a sound that was half groan, half prayer, and then his mouth was on hers and she was kissing him back with 5 years of pent-up longing and desperate need. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was hungry and fierce and tasted like all the words they hadn't said, all the time they'd lost. She pulled back, gasping, her hands fisted in his shirt, her body trembling. "We shouldn't be doing this. This is a terrible idea." "Probably," he agreed, his voice ragged. "Does that mean you want to stop?" She looked at him and saw the same desperate need reflected in his eyes that she felt. Saw the man she'd loved with everything she had. Saw the man who'd destroyed her. And made a choice that went against every bit of common sense she possessed. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to stop." What followed was inevitable as gravity. They came together with desperation that spoke of years of deprivation. Every touch was both familiar and brand new. He explored the changes in her body with reverent attention, kissing every scar. She mapped his body in return, finding new scars of his own. They moved together with a synchronicity that should not still exist after so much time, but it did. When they finally joined, when he pressed inside her with aching slowness, they both froze, overwhelmed by the intensity. "Look at me," he said, his voice strained. "I need you to see me. To know it's me." She opened her eyes and met his gaze, and what she saw there took her breath away. Love, pure, undiluted, unguarded love. And in that moment she stopped fighting, let herself fall into this with full knowledge it might destroy her again. They moved together slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, chasing something that felt like redemption, like healing, like coming home. When release came, it was mutual and shattering. He collapsed beside her, pulling her into his arms, and she went willingly. They lay there in the aftermath, reality beginning to creep back in. But exhaustion was pulling at her, and before she could form words, sleep claimed her. When she woke again, the sun was higher, and she was alone. Panic seized her briefly, until she heard the twins crying down the hall. She got up and pulled on the robe he'd left at the foot of the bed. She found Robert in the nursery, somehow managing to hold both twins, rocking them both with competence that surprised her. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was so tender it made her chest tight. "They were crying," he said softly. "I thought I'd let you sleep." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and watched him with her children. This was dangerous. This was more than physical. This was her heart opening up despite every warning. "Thandi," he said quietly. "About this morning—" "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't apologize. Don't tell me it was a mistake. I wasn't going to," he said. "I was going to tell you that I meant everything I said, that I love you, that I never stopped, that if you give me another chance, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I won't walk away again. But I also know words are cheap, so I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to let me show you. Let me prove it through actions." She walked over to him, looked down at her children in his arms, looked at his face with its mix of hope and fear and determination. "I can't promise anything. I can't promise I'll ever fully trust you again, or that this will work out. I know, he said, but, she continued, I'm willing to try, not because I'm sure it will work, but because the alternative is walking away from something that might be real, and I've spent 5 years regretting the things I didn't fight for. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, and when she leaned in to kiss him, gentle and brief, with the twins between them, it felt like a promise neither of them knew if they could keep, but were willing to risk everything to try. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that the night they'd shared had created more than just a tentative reconciliation, that the passionate hours in his bed had planted a seed that would grow into the most complicated gift either could imagine, that when she eventually left, when circumstances forced her hand, she'd be carrying more than just memories, she'd be carrying his daughter, but that revelation was still weeks away. And for now, in this moment, there was just the 4 of them in that bright nursery, trying to figure out how to build something new from the wreckage. It wouldn't be easy, but they were trying, and sometimes trying was enough to start with. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. For 2 weeks they existed in a fragile bubble of almost happiness. Robert adjusted his schedule to spend more time at home, to be present for morning feedings and evening baths, to share the weight of caring for 2 infants. They moved carefully around each other, testing boundaries, relearning how to be in the same space without armor. There were good moments, sweet moments, moments where she could almost believe this might actually work. And then there were moments where the past rose up like a ghost, and she remembered why trusting him was dangerous. They didn't talk about what they were, didn't define the relationship or make plans beyond the immediate future. It felt safer that way. He slept in her room more nights than not, but kept clothes in his own room, maintained the fiction that they were still separate people living separate lives who just happened to share space and sometimes a bed. It was a comfortable lie. She'd started looking for work, sending out applications to entry-level positions. The responses were disappointing but expected. No one wanted to take a chance on a single mother with gaps in employment and no marketable skills. But she kept trying because the alternative was accepting permanent dependence on Robert. On the 15th day, everything changed. She'd just put the twins down for their afternoon nap when nausea hit her with sudden violence. She barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. She sat on the cold tile floor, shaking and confused, because she'd been feeling fine all morning. Food poisoning, maybe. A stomach virus. Something that would pass. But it didn't pass. It happened again the next morning. And the morning after that. By the 4th morning, as she knelt over the toilet with Robert holding her hair back and rubbing circles on her back, a terrible suspicion began to form. A suspicion she immediately tried to dismiss because it was impossible, because her body was still recovering from giving birth, because she was breastfeeding, except not impossible. Never impossible. She bought a pregnancy test on a trip to the pharmacy, hiding it under the diapers and formula as if concealing it would make it less real. She waited until Robert left for a shift at the hospital, then locked herself in the bathroom with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. 3 minutes. She set a timer on her phone and paced the small bathroom, counting seconds, trying not to think about what a positive result would mean. How impossible the timing was. How unfair it felt to be pregnant again when she was still learning how to be a mother to the children she already had. The timer went off. She looked at the test. 2 pink lines, unmistakable, positive. She sank down onto the closed toilet lid and stared at those 2 lines until they blurred through tears. Pregnant. She was pregnant. With Robert's child. The man who'd left her once and might leave her again. The man she was trying to trust, but hadn't quite managed to. For 3 days, she carried the secret like a stone in her chest, unable to find the words to tell him, unable to decide if she should tell him at all. Maybe she could just leave, just disappear the way she had before. Start over somewhere new where no one knew her history. It would be hard, maybe impossible, But she'd survived impossible before. On the third night he found the test. She'd hidden it in the bathroom cabinet behind toiletries, but he'd been looking for something and moved things around. And there it was. He walked into the bedroom holding it, his face unreadable, and asked the question she'd been dreading. "Is this yours?" She could have lied. But she was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of pretending she could control outcomes. So she just nodded and watched his face. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the test still in his hand, staring at it. "How far along?" "I don't know. A few weeks, maybe. It would have to be from that morning. There hasn't been any other time since." "That morning," he repeated, and something that looked like wonder crossed his face before being replaced by concern. "Are you all right? Do you need to see a doctor?" Of course his first thought would be medical. "I'm fine. Just morning sickness. And the twins. Managing them while pregnant. That'll be difficult. We should hire help." "Stop," she interrupted. "Stop planning. Stop trying to fix this. Just tell me what you're feeling." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw too many emotions cross his face. "I don't know what I'm feeling. I'm shocked, terrified, overwhelmed, but also," he paused, searching for the right word, "happy. Is that wrong? To be happy about an unplanned pregnancy when you're clearly upset." "I'm not upset," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. She was scared and confused and worried about logistics, but somewhere underneath was a small, stubborn spark of happiness she was afraid to acknowledge. "I'm just trying to figure out what this means." "It means you're pregnant with my child," he said simply. "It means our lives just got more complicated. It means we have decisions to make. But mostly it means that I love you and I want this, if you want it. I want all of it. The chaos and the sleepless nights and raising 3 children. I want to do it with you." His words should have been comforting, should have been exactly what she needed to hear. But instead, they triggered something in her. "You say that now. You say you want this now. But what happens when it gets hard? What happens when your family finds out and starts pressuring you again? What happens when you wake up one day and realize you made a mistake?" "That won't happen," he said firmly. "You don't know that," she shot back. "You can't promise that. You promised before. You said I was your everything. You said you'd protect me. And then you walked away. So forgive me if I don't just take your word for it this time." He flinched, as if she'd slapped him, but didn't back down. "You're right. I can't make promises about the future because I broke them before. But I can tell you I'm not that man anymore. I spent 5 years living with the consequences of my cowardice. 5 years hating myself. 5 years learning that some mistakes don't get second chances. And then you showed up in my emergency room, and I got a miracle I didn't deserve. I'm not wasting it. I'm not walking away. Not from you, not from this baby, not ever again." "Pretty words," she said, but there was less heat in it now. "How do I know they're not just words?" "You don't," he said simply. "You have to decide if you're willing to risk trusting me again. I can't make that decision for you. I can only tell you that I'll spend every day for the rest of my life proving your trust isn't misplaced. That I'll choose you over my family. That I'll choose you over anything else that tries to come between us. That I love you enough to fight for this, even when it gets hard." She wanted to believe him, wanted it with an intensity that frightened her. But belief required faith, and faith required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the thing that had destroyed her before. "I need time to think. I need space to figure out what I want." "All right," he said quietly. "I'll give you space. But Thandi, however much time you need, however long it takes you to decide if you can trust me again, I'll be here." "I'm not leaving." He left the room, closing the door softly, and she was alone with her thoughts and her fears and a future that had just become exponentially more complicated. She lay down on the bed and placed a hand on her still flat stomach and tried to imagine what it would look like to let herself believe in second chances. She fell asleep, still searching for answers, and when she woke hours later to the sound of the twins crying, she found a note on the bedside table in Robert's handwriting. Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of a promise. "I am staying." She tucked the note into her pocket and went to tend to her children, and tried not to think about the fact that she wanted desperately for those words to be true, for him to mean them. But wanting something didn't make it real, and hope was a dangerous thing. So she held her children and whispered promises to the baby growing inside her that she'd protect them all, that she'd be enough even if no one else stayed. And she tried not to notice the way her heart was already starting to hope again, despite every warning, despite knowing better, because sometimes hope was stronger than fear. Sometimes it persisted even when you tried to kill it. And sometimes, against all odds, hope was the thing that saved you. She just didn't know yet if that would be true for her, or if hope would destroy her one more time before she learned to stop believing in impossible things. Chapter 8. The letter no one read. The decision came to her at 3 a.m. while feeding Elior. She couldn't stay. Not like this. Suspended in uncertainty, waiting to see if Robert would keep his promises or break them. She needed to give him space to decide what he really wanted without the pressure of her presence, without the daily reminder of all the ways his life had become complicated because she was in it. She would leave. Not forever, just for a little while, just long enough to get her own thoughts in order, to figure out if she could really trust him again or if she was just fooling herself. She'd go stay with an old colleague from one of her previous jobs, someone who'd offered help months ago. She'd take the twins and give Robert breathing room to think about what he wanted his life to look like, and she'd leave him a letter. Would tell him where she was going and why. Would give him her friend's address so he could find her when he was ready. Would make it clear this wasn't running away but stepping back. She spent the morning packing while Robert was at the hospital, trying not to cry as she folded tiny clothes. The twins seemed to sense something was wrong, both fussier than usual. She powered through, telling herself this was the right thing, the smart thing. The letter took her an hour to write. She told him about the pregnancy, about her fear, about needing time to think without the weight of his presence influencing her decisions. She told him she wasn't leaving because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much to stay without being sure. She wrote out her friend's address carefully, underlining it twice so he couldn't miss it. She ended with a promise that she'd be waiting, that when he was ready, she'd listen. She left the letter on his pillow, propped against the headboard where he couldn't miss it. She took one last look around the room that had briefly felt like home, at the nursery where he'd held her children with such care, at the house that had offered shelter. Then she called a cab, loaded the twins, and left before she could change her mind. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that Robert came home early that day. Came home in the middle of her departure, pulling into the driveway just as her cab was pulling out. He saw her in the back seat, saw the twins in their car seats, saw her pale face through the window as the cab drove past. He didn't see the letter, didn't know she'd left him an explanation, an address, a way to find her. All he saw was her leaving. Again, he stood in the empty house and felt something break inside him, something that had been barely holding together. He went upstairs to her room, looking for clues, for understanding. He saw the open drawers, the empty closet, the space where her things had been. He didn't see the letter on his bed because he never made it that far. Never got past the doorway, where the evidence of her departure hit him like a blow. He sank down, onto the floor right there in the hallway, and put his head in his hands and tried to understand what had just happened, tried to figure out what he'd done wrong, tried to process that she'd left him, had taken the twins, had walked out of his life. He should have known better than to hope, should have known that second chances were fairy tales. Meanwhile, Thandi arrived at her friend's apartment to discover the friend wasn't there, had moved 6 months ago without updating contact information. The apartment had new tenants who looked at her with confusion. She stood in the hallway with 2 crying babies and all of her possessions in a single bag and felt panic rising. She had no backup plan, had put everything into this one option, had been so certain this friend would help. She pulled out her phone to call Robert, to tell him what had happened. But the phone was dead, had died sometime during the cab ride. She tried the payphone in the lobby, but it was broken. She had no money for another cab. Had spent the last of her cash on the ride here. Had no credit cards, no bank account, nothing. She was stranded with 2 infants who needed to be fed and changed, and she had nowhere to go and no way to reach anyone. For the first time since leaving the hospital, she understood the full magnitude of what she'd done. She'd left safety for a plan that had fallen apart before she even arrived. She'd left Robert without giving him the letter that would have explained everything. She'd gambled everything on a friend who wasn't there. She found a bench outside the building and sat down, the twins in their car seats on either side of her. The afternoon was fading into evening. Soon it would be dark. Soon she'd need to find shelter, food, a place to keep her children safe. She'd been homeless before, had survived worse. She could do it again if she had to. But the thought of subjecting her babies to the kind of deprivation she'd endured made her physically ill. They deserved better. They deserved safety and warmth and full bellies. Hours passed. The twins cried, and she fed them and changed them and tried to keep them comfortable, while her mind spun, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. People walked past, some glancing with pity, others with suspicion, most not looking at all. She was invisible in the way homeless people are invisible, a problem too big to solve. As darkness fell, a woman approached her, older, well-dressed, with kind eyes. She asked if Thandi needed help, if she had somewhere to go. Thandi wanted to lie, wanted to maintain the fiction that she had everything under control, but exhaustion had stripped away her ability to pretend. She told the truth. She had nowhere to go. No money, no phone, no way to reach anyone who might help. The woman made a call, and within minutes a social worker arrived. Young, efficient, sympathetic but professional. She explained about shelters, about emergency assistance. But all the shelters were full. All the emergency housing was occupied. The best she could offer was a waiting list and a warm meal at a community center. Thandi accepted because she had no other choice, and let herself be guided to a building that smelled of industrial cleaners and desperation. She fed her children and ate food that tasted like nothing, and tried not to think about the house she'd left, the man who might have given her everything if she'd been brave enough to stay. The letter sitting unread on a bed in an empty house. She spent that night on a cot in a room full of other women with their own stories of how life had led them here. She held her babies and whispered promises she didn't know if she could keep. Tomorrow she'd find a working phone, would call Robert, would beg him to come get them if he was willing, would swallow her pride and admit she'd made a mistake. But tonight, in this shelter, she allowed herself to cry for the mess she'd made, for the perfect life she'd walked away from out of fear, for the letter sitting unread that would have changed everything if only Robert had found it. She cried until she had no tears left, then held her children closer and tried to believe that morning would bring better options. Across the city, Robert sat in his dark house and stared at walls that had briefly felt less empty, and tried to figure out how to survive losing her twice. He didn't know about the letter, didn't know she'd meant to explain, didn't know that her leaving had been about fear rather than rejection. He only knew that she was gone, that he'd been abandoned again, that every promise he'd made had been useless against whatever had driven her away. He went to bed alone and didn't sleep, and upstairs on his pillow the letter waited in the dark. A map to a destination no one would ever follow because no one knew it existed. Sometimes the worst tragedies are not the ones that happen, but the ones that almost happen. The near misses and miscommunications that create chasms where bridges should have been. And sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes timing matters more. Sometimes a letter left unread changes everything. And sometimes the distance between two people who love each other is measured not in miles, but in the simple failure of one person to walk 5 more steps into a bedroom and see the words that would have made all the difference. That night, 2 people who loved each other slept in separate places, both believing they'd been abandoned, both convinced that hope was a lie, neither knowing that a single piece of paper contained all the answers they were desperately seeking. And in the morning, when Thandi found a working phone and called the number she'd memorized, Robert's phone would ring in an empty house where he wasn't present to answer, because timing, as always, was everything. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Thandi managed to scrape together change from strangers and called Robert's number from a payphone the next morning. It rang and rang until voicemail picked up. His voice, professional and distant. She left a message, trying to keep her voice steady, as she explained where she was, what had happened, begging him to call back at the shelter. Then she hung up and waited, feeding the twins and trying to ignore curious stares, checking with the front desk every 10 minutes to see if anyone had called. No one had. She tried again at noon, and again at 3. Each time it went straight to voicemail, and she left increasingly desperate messages. By evening, she had to accept a terrible possibility. Either he couldn't answer, or he was choosing not to. Either something had happened to him, or he'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Both options made her chest feel like it was caving in. What she didn't know was that Robert hadn't been home to hear her first message. Hadn't even looked at his phone, which he'd left charging in his office while he buried himself in work. Taking every shift offered, volunteering for every surgery, doing anything to keep his mind occupied. When he finally picked up his phone that evening and saw 8 missed calls from an unknown number, he deleted them without listening. Probably a telemarketer. Probably nothing important. He went home to his empty house and poured himself a drink he didn't want, and tried to figure out how to exist in a space that had briefly contained everything, and now contained nothing but reminders of loss. He walked past her room without looking inside, couldn't bear to see the empty closet and the made bed. He didn't go into the nursery. He ended up in his study, and this time he did walk to his bedroom afterward. He fell onto his bed, still fully clothed, and closed his eyes. His hand brushed against paper on the pillow, crumpled it, pushed it aside without looking. Just laundry, probably. He rolled over and pulled a pillow over his head, and finally, hours later, fell into restless sleep. The letter lay crumpled on the floor where it had fallen. Unread and forgotten, Thandi spent 3 days in the shelter, each day calling Robert's number and leaving messages that became shorter and less hopeful. By the 3rd day, she'd stopped expecting him to answer, had accepted that he'd made his choice, that her leaving had been the final straw. She applied for emergency assistance, filled out forms, sat through interviews. She fed her children and kept them comfortable in circumstances that were steadily deteriorating her spirit. On the 4th day, Juan Rios found her. She never figured out how he tracked her down. Maybe he'd been watching. Maybe he had contacts. Maybe it was just terrible luck. However it happened, he appeared outside the shelter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and words that sounded almost reasonable. He wanted to talk. Just talk. He'd heard she was in trouble. He wanted to help. He was the father of those children after all. He had rights. He had responsibilities. He wanted to step up. Every instinct screamed not to believe him, not to engage. But desperation makes people stupid, and she was desperate enough to listen when he said he had an apartment, when he said there was room for her and the twins, when he said he had a job now and could provide. She knew it was a trap, knew he wanted something. But the alternative was staying in this shelter indefinitely, so when he offered his hand and said they could start over, that he'd changed, that he wanted to be there for his kids, she took it, not because she believed him, but because she had nowhere else to go. The apartment was small and dirty and smelled of things she didn't want to identify. He set down rules immediately. She would work. He would watch the kids. She would pay for groceries and rent. He would provide housing. It was transactional, cold, but it was shelter. Within a week, the truth revealed itself. He didn't have a job. He had debts. He had gambling problems and creditors who called demanding payment. He needed money, and she was his source. When she found work cleaning offices at night, he took most of her paycheck before she brought it home. When she protested, he reminded her that he was providing childcare, that she owed him. She endured it because she had no choice, because leaving meant being homeless again. because her children needed diapers and formula. She worked herself to exhaustion, came home to crying babies and a man who'd done nothing all day, and fell into bed too tired to even cry. Meanwhile, Robert existed in a numb fog. He went to work, he performed surgeries, he saved lives. And then he went home and sat in the dark and wondered how he'd managed to destroy the same woman twice. His colleagues noticed, his performance suffered. He made mistakes that were caught before they became dangerous, but were alarming enough that his supervisor pulled him aside and suggested he take time off. He refused. Work was the only thing keeping him functional. If he stopped, he'd fall apart completely. So he kept working, kept moving, kept existing in the hope that eventually the pain would fade. It was one of the nurses who finally made the connection. She'd been in the operating room that first night when Thandi came in, had seen Robert's reaction, had watched the way he'd acted around her during recovery. She'd put pieces together and kept quiet because it wasn't her business. But after watching him deteriorate for weeks, she decided someone needed to intervene. She found him in his office one evening and asked bluntly if he'd heard from the patient from that night, the one with the twins, Thandi. He looked at her with haunted eyes and said no. She'd left. It was over. The nurse studied him for a long moment and then asked when he'd last been home, when he'd last checked his messages, when he'd last actually looked through his house. Something in her tone made him pause, made him actually consider what she was asking. He couldn't remember the last time he'd checked voicemail, couldn't remember looking through anything in Thandi's room, had been avoiding those spaces. The nurse suggested gently that maybe he should check, just to be sure, just to make certain he hadn't missed something. People didn't usually leave without a word. People usually left explanations, even when they were running. Maybe there was something he'd overlooked. He went home that night actually intending to look, steeled himself to enter Thandi's room and search it properly, but he made it only as far as his own bedroom before exhaustion hit him. He collapsed onto his bed, and his hand landed on crumpled paper that had been sitting on his floor for weeks. He picked it up without thinking, started to throw it away, then noticed handwriting. Her handwriting. He sat up, smoothed out the paper, started reading. By the second paragraph, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the page. By the end, he was on his feet and grabbing his car keys and running for the door with the letter clutched in his hand. She hadn't left because she didn't want him. She'd left to give them both space. She'd left him an address. She'd left him a way to find her, and he'd missed it. Had let this letter sit unread for weeks while she was out there somewhere thinking he'd abandoned her. The address led him to an apartment building in a neighborhood that made him lock his car doors twice. He climbed stairs that smelled of urine and desperation and knocked on the door, already knowing from the age of the paper that she wasn't going to answer. A stranger opened it, confirmed they'd been living there for months, didn't know anyone named Thandi. He went to the shelter she'd mentioned in one of the voicemails he'd deleted. They confirmed she'd been there, but had left with a man who claimed to be the father of her children. They didn't have a forwarding address. Suggested he try social services, file a missing persons report maybe. He tried everything. Called every shelter. Filed reports with police who looked bored and said they'd keep an eye out. Hired private investigators who took his money and came back with nothing. She'd vanished, and this time he knew it was his fault. This time he had the letter that proved she'd wanted him to find her, and he'd failed her. Weeks turned into months. His search became obsessive. He neglected work, spent every free moment trying to find some trace of her. His savings dwindled. Most leads went nowhere. But he kept trying because stopping meant accepting he'd lost her forever. He was in his office late one evening when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered, hoping it was a lead. Instead, he heard a small voice ask if this was Dr. Finney. He confirmed it was. There was a pause, and then the voice said there was a woman here who needed help. She wouldn't give her name, but she kept asking for this number. She was in bad shape. Could he come? He was moving before the voice finished speaking, grabbing his coat, demanding an address. He broke every traffic law getting there. The address was a hospital on the far side of the city. He ran through the emergency room doors, already asking for her, describing her, begging someone to tell him where she was. A nurse led him to a room and pulled back the curtain, and there she was, Thandi. Looking so thin he barely recognized her, bruises on her arms, exhaustion written into every line of her face. She was holding a baby, a girl, smaller than the twins had been, with dark hair and features that looked disturbingly like his own. Their eyes met, and he saw hope and fear and desperate relief all at once. "You came," she whispered. "I didn't get the letter," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't see it until weeks later. I've been searching for you ever since. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't find it sooner," she started crying. And he moved to the bed and pulled her into his arms as carefully as he could, mindful of the baby between them, and let her sob against his chest while he whispered apologies and promises and pleas for forgiveness. They stayed like that until the storm passed, until she could breathe normally again. She told him everything, about Juan, about the apartment, about working herself to exhaustion while he took her money, about getting pregnant and being terrified to tell Juan, about hiding the pregnancy until it was too obvious and then being thrown out, about giving birth alone with no one to call. She told him about the daughter she'd just delivered, about how she knew the moment she saw her that this baby was his, not Juan's, that the timing made it impossible for it to be anyone else's child, about how she'd asked the nurse to call him, not knowing if he would answer, taking one last desperate chance. And he had come, had dropped everything and run to her, was here now holding her and promising that this time he wouldn't fail. "What's her name?" he asked softly, looking down at the baby. "I was waiting for you," she said. "I wanted you to help me choose." They named her together, sitting in that hospital room, with their daughter between them and years of mistakes behind them. They named her Serafina Grace, Serafina meaning fiery one, Grace meaning mercy, redemption, the gift of being forgiven when you don't deserve it. It was perfect, and when he finally asked what happens now, "What do we do next?" she looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering, but still held hope, and said the only thing that mattered: "We try again. We try again, and this time we don't let anything tear us apart." He kissed her forehead and promised he'd spend the rest of his life making sure. Nothing did. He didn't know yet about all the battles that lay ahead. Didn't know that his family would fight harder than before. Didn't know that Juan would come back demanding rights. Didn't know about the legal fights and emotional warfare. But in that moment, holding his daughter and the woman he loved, having finally found her after months of desperate searching, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that they were together, that they were trying. That love, against all odds, had survived long enough to be given one more chance. And sometimes one more chance was all you needed. Chapter 10. When love refuses to die, Robert brought them home the next day. And this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. He carried Serafina while Thandi managed the twins. And when they crossed the threshold, he turned to her and said with absolute certainty that this was their home now, not his. That she wasn't a guest, but the woman he intended to spend the rest of his life with if she'd let him. She'd nodded, too exhausted to do anything else, and let him guide her to the master bedroom, not the guest room she'd occupied before. When she started to protest, he stopped her with a look that contained years of regret and determination. They were done pretending, done maintaining walls, done acting like they were anything other than what they'd always been. Two people who loved each other despite every reason not to. The first week was adjustment, learning how to parent 3 children, learning how to exist in the same space without armor, learning how to be vulnerable after so much time spent protecting themselves. Robert took leave from the hospital, refused to go back until Thandi said she was ready, and she realized with wonder that he meant it. He was choosing them over everything else. Finally, completely. Serafina was a week old when Robert's mother called. He hadn't spoken to her since Thandi left the first time, had let the calls go to voicemail. But she was persistent, and eventually he answered, because avoiding her forever wasn't realistic. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. She demanded to know where he'd been, why he was neglecting family obligations. He told her the truth in words that were calm but immovable. He'd found Thandi. She'd given birth to his daughter. He was building a life with her and 3 children. His mother's response was predictable: shock, outrage, accusations that Thandi had trapped him, threats about what this would do to the family reputation. He listened until she ran out of words. And then he said something he should have said 5 years ago. "I'm done letting you control my life. I'm done choosing your approval over my happiness. I love Thandi. I love my daughter. I love the twins as if they were my own blood. And if accepting that costs me my place in this family, then I'm choosing them over you." Every single time. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then his mother said, in a voice made of ice, that she'd come to see this situation for herself, to meet this woman who'd apparently destroyed her son's common sense. Robert agreed because he knew the confrontation was inevitable. His mother arrived 3 days later with an entourage that included his father, 2 aunts, and a cousin who worked in law, clearly brought along to assess legal ramifications. They stood in the foyer like an invading army, taking in the evidence, baby equipment scattered across expensive furniture, the sound of infants crying from upstairs, the general chaos. Thandi came down the stairs carrying Serafina, flanked by Robert, who held Elior, while Amara dozed in a carrier against his chest. The image they presented was undeniable: a family. Not a conventional one, perhaps, but real nonetheless. His mother's eyes swept over them with an expression that could have frozen water. "So this is what you've chosen," she said. "This woman and these children over everything we built." "This woman has a name," Robert said quietly. "Thandi Lumi. And yes, I've chosen her. I'm choosing her. I will always choose her." His mother turned her attention to Thandi, and the look she gave her was designed to strip away dignity, to make her feel small. Thandi had felt that look before, had crumbled under it once, but the woman standing there holding Robert's daughter wasn't the same girl who'd begged on a sidewalk 5 years ago. This woman had survived abandonment and poverty and abuse. This woman had given birth alone and clawed her way back. This woman wasn't going to be intimidated. "You trapped him," his mother said. "First time didn't work, so you found another way. Got pregnant deliberately." "That's enough," Robert started, but Thandi raised a hand. "Let her finish," Thandi said calmly. "Let her say everything." "I want to hear it all," his mother continued, warming to the topic, listing every way Thandi was unsuitable, every reason this would end in disaster, every piece of evidence that she was a parasite. The words were designed to wound, chosen for maximum impact, delivered with precision. Thandi listened without flinching, without crying, without giving his mother the satisfaction. When the tirade finally wound down, Thandi spoke into the ringing silence. "Are you finished? Because I have something to say now, and you're going to listen. Your son loved me 5 years ago. Loved me enough that it frightened him, frightened you, frightened everyone who saw how complete it was. And you couldn't stand that. Couldn't stand that he'd found something you didn't choose. So you lied to him. You fabricated evidence. You poisoned his mind against me because you'd rather see him miserable and obedient than happy and independent. And it worked. He left me. He destroyed me. But I survived it. I survived losing him. I survived poverty and abuse, and every terrible thing that happened after. I survived giving birth alone. I survived all of it without your money or your approval or anything from your family, except pain. So now, when you stand in this house and tell me I'm not good enough, understand this. I don't need you to think I'm good enough. I don't need your approval. I only need Robert, and he's already chosen me. So you can accept that and find a way to be part of his life, or you can leave. But you will never make me feel small again. Those days are over. The silence that followed was absolute. No one in that room had ever spoken to his mother that way. The shock on her face would have been comical if the moment weren't so serious. But before she could formulate a response, Juan Rios walked through the front door. Robert hadn't locked it after his family arrived. and Duan took advantage, strolling in with confidence that suggested either stupidity or desperation. He looked at the gathered assembly, at Thandi with the baby, at Robert with the twins, and smiled in a way that made Thandi's blood run cold. "Interesting family meeting," Juan said casually. "Hope I'm not interrupting. I just came to discuss visitation rights for my children. I'm their father, after all." Thandi felt her grip tighten on Serafina. "You have no rights. You abandoned us. You threw me out. You have no claim." "See, that's where you're wrong," Juan said, pulling papers from his jacket. "I consulted with a lawyer. Turns out abandonment is hard to prove when I can demonstrate I tried to be involved. When I can show evidence of you refusing my help." "That's a lie," Thandi said, but her voice shook because she knew how easily lies could become truth in courtrooms. "Maybe," Juan shrugged. "Maybe not. Either way, I figure we can settle this without courts. You pay me what I'm owed for years of missing out on my kids' lives, and I walk away. Nobody needs lawyers." He named a number that made Robert's jaw clench. Extortion, pure and simple. He was blackmailing her using her own children. Thandi felt tears of rage and helplessness building. But then Robert stepped forward, and the expression on his face made Juan take an involuntary step back. When Robert spoke, his voice was quiet and cold, and more terrifying than shouting. "Let me make something very clear. You have no rights to these children. You abandoned them. You abused their mother. You threw her out when she needed you most. And now you show up trying to blackmail her. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. Right now. And you're never going to contact Thandi or these children again. Because if you do, I will make it my personal mission to destroy you. I will hire lawyers who will dig up every law you've ever broken, every debt you owe, every lie you've told. I will make sure you spend years in legal battles that drain whatever resources you think you have. I will make sure every judge in this city knows exactly what kind of man you are. And when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never walked through that door. You can't threaten me," Juan said, but the bravado was cracking. "That wasn't a threat," Robert said. "That was a promise. Now get out of my house." Juan looked around the room, seemed to calculate his odds, and decided discretion was the better part of valor. He left with his papers, slamming the door in a gesture meant to salvage dignity, but only emphasized his defeat. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Robert turned to his family, and his voice when he spoke carried weight that made clear this wasn't up for discussion. "You heard her story. You saw what just happened. You know now what she's survived, what she's endured. So I'm going to say this once, and I need you to understand. I mean every word. Thandi is going to be my wife. These children are going to be my family. You can accept that and be part of our lives, or you can cling to your pride and lose me forever. Your choice. But make it now." His mother looked at him, really looked at him, and seemed to see for the first time the man he'd become rather than the boy she remembered. She looked at Thandi holding Serafina, at the way Robert stood beside her like a wall, at the children who existed as living proof that love could survive. Something shifted in her expression, some calculation being made. "What's her name?" his mother asked finally, gesturing to the baby. "Your daughter, Serafina Grace," Robert said, and his hand found Thandi's, fingers lacing together. His mother moved closer, slowly, as if approaching something fragile. She looked down at Serafina's sleeping face, and Thandi saw the exact moment when recognition hit, when she saw her son's features reflected. "She has your eyes," his mother said quietly. "And your nose?" "She does," Robert agreed. His mother reached out one hand, hesitated, looked at Thandi for permission. Thandi, after a moment that felt like standing on a cliff deciding whether to jump, nodded. His mother touched Serafina's cheek with one finger, and something in her face crumbled. Some wall that had been holding back decades of rigidity. "I've been cruel," she said, and the admission seemed to cost her something. "To you, to my son. I told myself it was protection, that I was saving him. But I was wrong. I see that now. I can't undo what I did, can't give back what I took. But I'm asking if there might be room for me to try, to be part of this family you're building, to know my granddaughter, Thandi looked at Robert, saw the hope and caution warring in his expression. She could say no, could refuse to forgive, could keep his mother at a distance as punishment. Part of her wanted exactly that. But she looked down at Serafina, thought about the twins, thought about the family she wanted to build, and made a choice that felt impossibly hard and somehow right. "You can know your granddaughter," Thandi said slowly. "You can be part of their lives. But understand this. If you ever try to come between Robert and me again, if you ever make him choose, if you ever treat me as less than I am, you'll lose access to all of us. These are my terms. Accept them or leave." His mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I accept." The family stayed for another hour, meeting the twins properly, holding Serafina with reverence, slowly beginning the difficult work of building bridges across chasms. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first step. When they finally left, when the house was quiet except for sleeping babies, Robert and Thandi collapsed onto the couch together, exhausted and overwhelmed and somehow victorious. He pulled her against his side, and she let her head rest on his shoulder. "Marry me," Robert said suddenly. "Not because of the baby, or because of what just happened, or because of any reason, except that I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Thandi pulled back to look at him. "Are you sure?" "Really sure? Because if we do this, there's no going back. No running when things get hard. I've never been more sure," he said. "I've lost you twice. I won't survive losing you a third time. So marry me. Let me put a ring on your finger that tells the world you're mine and I'm yours. Let me stand up and promise to love you for the rest of my life. Let me finally do this right." She kissed him instead of answering with words, poured 5 years of longing and pain and desperate hope into that kiss. And when she pulled back, she was crying and laughing and nodding. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." The wedding happened 3 months later in the same garden where she'd once imagined getting married before that dream died. But this time, it was real, and she wore white without shame, and Robert stood at the altar looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. The twins were there, holding Robert's hands as they walked down the aisle because he'd insisted. Serafina slept in a basket held by his mother. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, there was silence. When Robert said his vows, his voice never wavered. When Thandi said hers, she looked directly into his eyes and promised to trust him, even though it was the scariest thing she'd ever done. When they kissed, the twins clapped and Serafina woke up crying, and the whole thing was beautifully imperfect, in exactly the way real life should be. At the reception, Robert pulled Thandi onto the dance floor, and they swayed together while their guests watched and their children played nearby, with family who were learning how to love them. He whispered in her ear all the things he wanted for their future, all the dreams he had for the family they were building, all the ways he planned to make sure she never regretted giving him another chance. "I love you," he said simply. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being brave enough to let me try again." "I love you too," she whispered back. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for staying." Years later, when Serafina was old enough to ask about how her parents met, Thandi would tell her the truth. Not a sanitized fairy tale, but the real story, with all its pain and mistakes and terrible choices. She'd tell her daughter about the billionaire who walked away, and the woman who survived being destroyed, about letters that went unread, and second chances that seemed impossible, about the night when everything changed and the morning when love refused to die. And she'd tell her that the most important lesson was this: love isn't enough on its own. Love needs courage, needs commitment, needs 2 people willing to fight for it even when walking away would be easier, needs forgiveness and growth, and the willingness to try again, even after catastrophic failure. Love without those things is just a feeling that fades. But love combined with choice, with daily decision to stay and work and build something together, that kind of love can survive anything. Serafina would listen with wide eyes and then ask the most important question. "But you did stay, right? You and Daddy? You made it work?" And Thandi would smile and pull her daughter close and say, "Yes, They stayed, they made it work, they built a life together that was messy and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. She'd tell her daughter that every morning she woke up and chose to love Robert again, and every morning he chose her back. And that collection of daily choices had added up to a lifetime of happiness that almost never happened. She'd tell her daughter that the greatest love stories aren't the ones where everything goes perfectly. They're the ones where everything goes wrong, and the people involved refuse to give up on each other anyway. Where they stumble and fall and make terrible mistakes, but keep getting back up and trying again. Where they learn that happy endings aren't things that just happen, but things you build deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge that you might fail, but determination to try anyway. And when Serafina asked if she believed in fairy tales, Sandy would say no, she believed in something better. She believed in real love, the kind that survived fire and came out stronger. The kind that refused to die even when everything conspired to kill it. The kind that proved every single day that choosing each other was worth whatever price had to be paid. That was their story. Not perfect, not easy, but real and hard-won and infinitely precious, because they'd almost lost it so many times and somehow, against all odds, managed to hold on. Some bridges don't burn. Some loves refuse to die. And sometimes, if you're very brave and very lucky and willing to fight for it with everything you have, you get a second chance to build the life you always wanted with the person you never stopped loving. That was their story. Messy and beautiful and absolutely true. And they lived it day by day, choice by choice, for the rest of their lives together. Because in the end, love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about waking up every morning and deciding that this person, this complicated, flawed, imperfect person, was worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth choosing over and over again until choice became habit and habit became a lifetime, and that was the greatest love story of all.